Hi, my name is Craig Adams, Chief Product Officer at Rapid7. Thank you so much for joining us today as we continue our Expert on Expert series. I couldn't be more excited for our guest, Sabeen, Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Rapid7. Hey, tell me, kick this off. What does one do in that role on a regular basis?
Yeah, thanks so much, Craig. I'm so excited to be here with you. Honestly, it's a little bit of think about it as like an ambassador for the company with operational experience and expertise in making sure that we are both advocates and making sure that policy and the business environment for our company is the best in which our products can operate. So hopefully, in a nutshell, what that really means is my day to day is I'm both an ambassador, so I work with our CEO and my colleagues, including yourself, to sort of think about our government stakeholders, some of our institutional stakeholders as, a conduit to them if they have specific questions around product, features, just generally what's happening in the industry. We're sort of that conduit for them. New market access when we're thinking about opening up new offices or what the landscape looks like or what are things that we should be thinking about in terms of, just again, things that might just out of the ordinary, we should be thinking about building into our risk models. That is another area where, my shop is excelling, and I would like to think that, we provide that insight. Policy work. I mean, there's just a lot that you can imagine. We are a global company, so we get a lot of requests from different stakeholders to basically give some inputs on, laws, regulations, different types of even industry association bodies that are thinking about standards and norms. And then just generally partnerships. I mean, as you know, Craig, I mean, Rapid7's history has always been about working with our community and, kind of being a champion for not only open source and others that are part of that, but, really thinking about the cyber community as really sort of a global community. So we try to create as much linkage between that as we can.
So let's talk about the subject of trust in cybersecurity, because that's such a hot one. We're
Right.
seeing the widening trust gap between public, private, government sectors, particularly when it comes to transparency around breaches. From your perspective, what's driving this divide?
Yeah, so I think, look, on the one hand, there's a lot more regulation that's talking about transparency, right? There's just requirements of if there's an incident, if there's some version of something that is going to impact a specific type of stakeholder, customer, institutional investor, investor writ large, or just, there's a certain size by which you are having an impact, you need to report. But I think what happens is for a lot of, let's say, differentiation between why and the how. Like how many hours before you need to report versus what you need to report. Because there's so much little nuance and differentiation, I think there's a lot of just unevenness in how it's applied in terms of what the concept is. So that inconsistency erodes a lot of credibility. And what happens is I think folks think, well, this is really not about resilience then, because if it was, everyone would think about it more consistently. And I think without that, then everyone thinks of it more as like a check the box exercise. And that's why you sort of see this as less of a enabler for resilience and more like someone just has maybe a design around, we need to get that information faster because we want to be first to know, which doesn't sound like a very good place to be when you're thinking about transparency for resilience purposes.
So you worked at the intersection between regulation and real world execution for a while. How do we prevent policy from becoming a disconnected from what actually works in security operations?
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is you have to really think about a couple things. So I look at it as like policy is an enabler at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And a lot of what policy is supposed to do is set guidelines, guardrails, and also just red lines in terms of then thinking about how businesses can operate both in terms of the products and services they're providing, but then even thinking about to your point where we started around what is it the information that is needed in order for governments to do their job, which is reduce harm for their populations. And I think what's happening right now is because at the end of the day, there is a lot of different little buckets of, I would say, data policies that are impacting the business of just being a company. And every company is a data company these days. Every company is online. You are first and foremost a tech company, even. And so I think what happens in the day-to-day minutia of thinking about, okay, what am I have liability for? What do I actually have reputational risk around? And then what are the things that I want to do just because I want to, again, build trust with my customer base? What are the things that are needed to do? And that, Craig, is not just about policy at the end of the day. It's
Right.
trust, it's technology, it's talent, and how do you make these things interoperable in a way that everyone reduces their risk, but doesn't create, again, friction for the sake of saying, well, we think that if we put this law out there, this regulation out there, that somehow it's going to have the intent of having all of those risks mitigated by magically just doing something that we think is going to be, for a lot of companies, unfortunately or fortunately, looking at this still as, oh, someone told me to do something. I'm supposed to make it operational, but I haven't lived the spirit of it at the end of the
Right,
day.
right,
As
right.
you know, cyber is a very unique domain. Threats come from various different vectors. They're not the same. We kind of
Right.
know what we know the methodologies, but we don't know in terms of which piece of software, what is actually going to be used, how do we sort of live in that world? And so, policy has to be reflective of that. It's better for it to think about it as scaffolding rather than saying this is the only box that you can live in. And I think that's the tension that, you're kind of alluding to, is how do we sort of do that? And having done this now for over 15 years, I think governments are getting better about understanding that this is really at the operational layer, but you
Right.
have to give operators a lot of flexibility in order to think about the answers to really get to what they want to see, which is a type of reduction of a particular harm.
Yeah, so we've seen a big rise in insider-driven breaches, negligent behavior, um, but really like monetized access and recruitment. So, what challenges and changes should companies be making culturally, structurally, or even legally to try to get ahead of this?
Yeah, so I think a lot of first of all need to think of threat insider or insider threats as not a surveillance issue, but it's really about sharing with, I think, at the top, from the bottom, as to what is actually the idea around transparency and why it matters in your company. What do you risk by then also saying, if you're going to share that information outside this kind of trusted group, what happens in that culture? And that's a just really like honest conversation that I think companies need to have about what is accessible and to whom and why. And then also, I think really talking honestly about just what does the outside world, outside of sort of your little like laptop and sort of structure that you've created where you log in online, everything seems seamless, as to what's really happening once you get online. And I think that's sharing just anecdotes, thinking a little bit more about anomalies and behaviors that might seem innocuous if one person does it, but if hundreds of people are doing it, that
Right.
again increases your risk, right? So I think, first of all, leadership really matters here. I think people just need to have honest conversations about what's lost by sort of thinking about the fact that if you are sharing things in a context in which it's not supposed to be shared, how much do you sort of then risk also harming your company culture? I think in terms of legal frameworks, look, whistleblower protections also, I think, is an area that should be thought more about here as opposed to just punishment, in terms of thinking about if someone has not created the right controls for, sharing that information. And then again, what sort of harm is done to the data that's breached or, exfiltrated. I think we have to think about this as prevention through trust, not paranoia, and sort
Mm,
of think about the
I like
idea that, yeah, that, we have to build that trust together. And the more sort of paranoia you create around it as to like, oh my God, like, keep it closed. There's going to be something that happens if you don't. I think you don't also create owners in your culture then. And that's really what it is.
that.
Everybody's an owner of the information they're creating. And the
Right.
more you feel like you have ownership over that and you want to share it with whom you want to, I think it just creates a better framework for then thinking about both liabilities and then also protections, whereas sometimes, folks are not doing the right things. I mean, we know this every day. You wake up and you read a news story and you're like, there were just some basic preventative things that folks could have done and they chose not
Right.
to. And what are we really having the honest conversation to do that?
That's right. Let's talk about some different governments around the world and some
Yeah.
hot topics emerging. So, there was some recent guidance from the UK emphasizing how to be prepared, playbooks, contract keys, manual fallback processes. Do you think
Hmm.
guidance is being adopted at scale, or most orgs still
Yeah.
under misunderstanding basic resilience?
So I think there are two things. I think that in certain sectors that know and understand risk controls and have a better sense of the fact that trust is a big part of them being able to operate with their customers, they look at everything. So they'll look at guidelines as kind of soft as they are to then hard guidelines, regulations for their industry, and they just adopt them because they understand that that's kind of where the puck is moving. I think in the UK context, in particular, the report you're mentioning that also talked about a plan B is literally pen and pencil or pen and paper if everything goes offline. I mean, when you sort of think about that, yes, that is always an option. I mean, analog
Right,
is an
right.
option we need to also remember is a world that we occupy, but that doesn't really, I don't know, to me that felt very unsatisfactory to basically say plan for all these things and then the worst case scenario is bring out your pen and your pencil, and your piece of paper. And I think there's a lot of nuance between those two worlds. And so that to
Right,
me is
right,
where I
right.
felt like when you sort of think about why then companies or certain organizational resilience programs look at those things and dismiss them, it's because I think guidance should be more structured and more tailored. And I think sometimes when doing these, and that's not to say that, again, you can't boil the ocean in every report. Sometimes you have to make things as generic as possible just to raise the profile that these things matter. But I think in this particular instance, and with this report and these guidelines, I even was a little bit surprised by the sort of almost resigned nature of sort of saying there's just
Pen
some
and
things that we
paper.
can't do. Yeah, exactly. And I felt like there's so much more we can do, and
Right.
we haven't it's not to say that we have not scratched the surface. We've definitely scratched the surface and we've definitely done, I would say layer one, layer two. But I, live, breathe with you, Craig, every day. I think customers are really thinking about not just tooling, but also again, program design, just the shift
Right.
that's happened, and all of the different assets and how to bring that all together. What do you even need to understand about your sort of risk landscape for someone who is a CISO who's thinking about what inputs do I need to create my program and architect it well for my company?
You just hit my sweet spot when you talk
Yeah,
about limited attack surface visibility. Now, but
right.
let's transition to the U.S. government. The recent shutdown drew attention to just how dependent organizations are on centralized systems, agency coordination. What lessons should the private sector take from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, like I think personally, there is always a version of the world where no one entity, no one government agency, nor one government sort of anywhere in the world is able to predict nor have all insights into all the different risk factors that you as a company know about your business. It's just, even
Yeah.
in the best of times where you have a very specific committee of jurisdiction that is looking at your particular industry. You have a regulatory body that is looking at the risk for all of those things. I mean, there is just some insight that companies are going to have that, no matter what, government is just not going to because they're just not in it in the same way day to day. They are in it for national security purposes, but in your particular use case, they might not understand all the places where you've decided from your architectural, choices to your vendor choices to how you decided to mesh those together that are unique to you. So I think part of that is really just realizing that along with having really good relationships with your government stakeholders in your particular industry and sector, it is better to sort of also think about how do you widen that circle of trust and the inputs that you use to help develop your insights and to think about how do I widen that? How do I work with my, third party vendors? Just thinking about maybe bringing them together and saying, hey, what are you seeing? What are some things that I should be thinking about? I mean, just having that outreach is another place that I think you can get real time, real good real time information, just like you would from, let's say, doing your FBI calls or your CISA, sort of Intel insights and, joining ISACs and all that kind of stuff.
So I want to talk about the balance between resilience and regulation for a second. So as more countries implement breach notification laws, AI guidelines, sector-specific mandates, how do we balance the positives of regulation with the need for practical, flexible resilience for organizations?
I think they're two things, right? I mean, I think this is where, and I come at this from the place that technology itself doesn't have like one committee of jurisdiction, right? It's not like there's one, overarching technology source of truth. But the reality of it is that there are components of every technology that we can then think about in terms of the risks, the harms, and then what do we want to allow folks to be able to build that sort of creates that new emerging wave of the fun stuff, like the innovations that
Uh,
love to see that make enterprise use cases easier, efficient, that make customers real happy about the fact that it's like, great, this is customer centric. I'm very happy with what I'm seeing. It makes me be able to do my work faster and better. But I think when it comes to AI, we're just at the beginning stages of thinking about the use cases that are really what
right.
I would say ones that are so impactful, Craig, that we really have to think about, sort of global norms around what do we do collectively
Yeah.
as a society around them.
So Rapid7 just recently introduced our 2026 security predictions, and it
Mhm.
highlights the growing overlap between exposure, threat, governance, especially as AI scales both attack and defense.
Yeah.
What's your take of what organizations should be doing to evolve their readiness strategy and reviews?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say you have to build adaptive resilience. You can't think about this as like, hey, a one and done situation. It's not like you're like, okay, great. I, use the best frameworks out there. I use NIST insert here. I used, ISO insert here. I used all these things and then I put them on paper and then I put that process in a nice binder and I put that on the shelf. You have to think about, how have I sort of thought about these new
Yeah.
use cases and does the playbook actually reflect those things that I think are going to work for my business? Is it the idea that, have I thought about where does our data live? Which cloud infrastructure have I added and have I used, sort of again, this is where, and we will continue to talk about this hopefully, Craig, but like different providers will have their own version of what I consider to be their risk paradigm that you have to absorb and then think about in terms of, okay, what is our AI playbook? What AI risks do I feel like we want to take as a company? And who then is responsible for taking those risks and operationalizing them so that we also de-risk the architecture and all the AI use cases that we've used? And something that you've also mentioned, and again, I go back to this kind of adaptive resilience model, which is you can't just invest in detection engineering, threat exposure management, and attack surface reduction as just awareness. It's like, hey, I did
Right,
it. Great.
right.
We have it. You have to kind of, again, live it. Think about how do you evolve? And AI is an accelerant, but don't also think about it as like, oh, I am so what's the right word? I feel like it is a war, and I'm just like thinking about this from a war paradigm where I'm just always
Right,
going to
right.
be in, yeah, I'm always going to be in a defensive posture.
Fight
I
or
think,
flight, right?
yeah, I think you have to also think about outside of a defensive posture, what is it that you really want to excel at in terms of your use cases? And I think we're still going to see a lot of innovation in these spaces. A lot of, sort of these programs are going to evolve to be able to get to a place where I think we'll get to some happy medium. That's not to say that there won't be new threat vectors. That's not to say that AI won't introduce some new, let's say, well, let me put it this way. AI will have its own challenges in terms of the way that it's structured and architected, but AI on top of what you're already doing may also help you really de-risk or mitigate some of the initial problems that you had so that you
Yeah.
can focus on where you need to, which is the real threats and the real risks that you have
I,
based
I
on
feel
tech stuff.
super strong that the biggest risk of AI is not using AI as an organization. Let's go back to policy. You've seen how policy gets made. where it falls short. What's one area that you think regulators and industry bodies constantly overlook when it comes to cybersecurity?
So, two things. One is I think on still awareness. I still think that there has to be a sort of more like almost the way we think about campaigns, no smoking, making sure that folks understand that there is a version of the world where now everyone is going to interface with some digital piece of technology. And have we actually created that sort of baseline understanding? And I just still see it. I mean, I think there's a lot of both misunderstanding about what is actually happening as soon as you create your digital footprint online. But I think at the same time, it's not like you can't understand exactly what happens as soon as you fire up your laptop and you sort of start putting your digital assets online. And I think that's something where we can still do a lot of work. And this is not just about policy. I think it's just straight education, to be honest. And this is where we have to continue to build those resources. And I think another area that's underinvested in is the small, medium enterprises. I think that is an area that, enterprises for the most part, I think, and would love also, Craig, you live and breathe this, is it's not that they will not understand their risk, but fundamentally they understand that they have to do something about it. I think what
Right,
I
right.
see with small, medium enterprises or small, medium businesses is that I don't think they really even understand kind of what it takes in a modern context, in a modern digital economy. What are the tools and what type of resilience do they need to build? And I see this across the board globally.
Right.
It's an area where I think more investment, more policy work needs to be done.
All right. We're now going to go to lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a few rapid fire questions, quick answers as we wrap up our chat today. First, what keeps you up at night?
Oh, I mean, I still think that there's so much that is happening in these third-party intermediary space in terms of thinking about nation state actors using like a whole host of fronts to do a lot of this nefarious work of using cyber as both a constraint and a restraint on the ability of businesses globally to operate.
What gives you hope?
The fact that humans always find a way to do what they need to do.
Life advice for a happy life.
Follow your heart.
Uh, Biggest thing that you would change about cybersecurity regulation today?
It needs to get harmonized. There's just too many things that just are at, odds with each other, even though they want to get to the same end state. The idea that, all this nuance is going to help us get to that end state is very frustrating.
You're an organization trying to improve your posture. What's the first thing you should do if you haven't already done it?
Understand what are all the assets and things that you actually have online and figure out your footprint.
Sabine, always a pleasure to catch up. Thank you so much for joining us today for our series.
Thank you so much, Craig.